All right. Buckle up, everyone. We're diving deep into Aussie businesses today.
Sounds exciting.
It is. But we're tackling something a bit different this time, Australian restructuring law.
Interesting. Restructuring law, huh?
Yeah. I know it might not sound like the most thrilling topic,
Yeah,
but trust me, it's way more interesting than it sounds.
I'll take your word for it.
Plus, imagine this. You're about to close a deal with an Australian company. Or maybe
Yeah.
you just got hooked on some international finance documentary.
Uh-huh.
Either way, you got to know how Aussie businesses handle tough times, right?
Makes sense.
That's where this deep dive comes in.
All right, I'm ready.
We've got this awesome article from a legal journal. It's
Yeah.
called Restructuring Reform on the Agenda in Australia. Super recent.
So it's fresh off the press.
Yeah, it's packed with all these insights into the latest trends and how Australia compares to other countries
Gotcha.
and what the future might hold for, Aussie businesses facing a financial crunch.
Oh, so like what they're doing to change things.
Exactly. By the end of this, you'll be dropping knowledge bombs at your next virtual coffee chat.
I love it.
All right. So one thing that's fascinating about Australia
Yeah.
is that they've got this reputation for being pretty proactive when it comes to helping businesses get back on their feet.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about like watching them go under.
No, not at all. It's
Yeah.
more about, giving them a lifeline.
Okay.
And I've heard some amazing stories, actually.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Like this one company, they were hit hard by the pandemic, supply chain chaos, a mountain of debt.
Ooh, it sounds rough.
It was. But instead of just giving up, they used this process called voluntary administration, or VA.
VA? What's that?
It's like hitting the pause button, a chance to regroup.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they worked with their creditors, restructured their debts, and they're back in business now.
Wow, so it actually worked for them.
Yeah. It's pretty impressive how effective this system can be.
That's a great example. VA can be a real game changer for businesses. And it's the most common restructuring process in Australia.
It makes you wonder why, right?
It's for good reason. Think of it as a timeout, a chance for the company to breathe.
Yeah, I like that.
While an independent expert comes in to assess the situation,
Like a referee, almost.
kind of, they call this expert the administrator.
Okay.
And they figure out if there's a way forward, maybe restructuring debt, selling assets, or finding a new investor.
Makes sense. So they're like a troubleshooter, figuring out how to get the company back on track.
Exactly.
So Australia kind of did this major overhaul of their insolvency system back in the early 90s.
I see.
And it was based on this big review called the Harmer Report.
Okay.
VA was like one of the key outcomes.
So it's been a cornerstone of their approach ever since then.
Yeah, pretty much. And for a lot of businesses, especially the small to medium-sized ones, it's been a real lifeline.
But like any system, there's always room for improvement.
Of course.
And that's what this article really digs into, the areas where Australia's restructuring process could be even better.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me was the idea of extending protections
Protections. To who?
to the people who personally guaranteed loans for the company, like family or business partners.
Oh, right.
Because right now, they're not shielded during the VA process.
That's a good point. It could add a lot of extra stress for those folks.
Exactly. And there was also this call for more flexibility in crafting those restructuring plans, making sure they work for everyone involved.
Yeah, the company, the creditors, even the employees.
It shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach, right?
Not at all. Each situation is unique.
So we've established that Australia has this system that's helped a ton of businesses.
Yeah,
But there are some tweaks they could make to make it even more effective.
right.
But how does their approach stack up globally?
That's a good question.
Are they leading the pack or are they lagging behind?
In the global business world, everyone's always checking out the competition.
Always. So where does Australia stand?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
There's this international guidebook for insolvency law put together by the United Nations.
Oh, wow. So like a gold standard.
Exactly. It's called the UNCITRAL Legislative Guide, and it's basically a blueprint for countries looking to build a fair and robust restructuring system.
Gotcha. So Australia's got their system. The UN has their ideal system. How do they compare?
Well, overall, Australia actually aligns pretty well with those UN guidelines.
Okay, so not bad.
Not bad at all. But, and there's always a but, there are some areas where they could improve.
I knew there had to be a catch. What kind of areas are we talking about?
For instance, the UN guide recommends special ways to help companies access funding during insolvency.
So they can actually afford to restructure.
Exactly. It's like a financial bridge to help them get through the process.
Makes sense.
But Australia doesn't really have that, which can make things pretty tough for struggling businesses.
Yeah, imagine it'd be like trying to fix a car while you're still driving it. You need the right tools for the job.
It-
So what other gaps did you notice between Australia's approach and those global best practices?
One that stood out was how Australia handles contracts signed before a company becomes insolvent.
Ah, so like if they already had deals in place.
Exactly. The UN guide suggests having a clear system to decide which contracts should be honored and which can be renegotiated.
So everyone knows where they stand.
Right, it creates predictability and fairness.
Okay.
But Australia's system's a bit more ad hoc.
Ad hoc. What does that mean?
It means things aren't always clear-cut, and that can lead to legal battles and delays.
Oh, so it's like trying to untangle a giant knot of contracts, not exactly ideal when time is of the essence.
Yeah, it can get pretty messy.
So what else jumped out at you?
Australia is actually stricter than the UN guidelines when it comes to insolvent trading laws.
Insolvent trading. That sounds serious.
It is. These laws are meant to stop company directors from piling on more debt when they know the business is going under.
So they can't just keep spending money they don't have.
Exactly. But while the intention is good, some argue that Australia's laws are a bit too harsh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that they can actually discourage directors from taking risks to try and save the company.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Kind of. It creates this fear factor that can lead to companies shutting down prematurely.
So it's about finding the right balance between protecting creditors and encouraging smart risk-taking.
You got it. And that seems to be a theme in a lot of these potential reforms.
Yeah, it's a challenge for policymakers everywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Now, let's zoom in on a program specifically designed to help small businesses navigate these choppy financial waters.
Okay.
It's called the Small Business Restructuring Regime, or SBR for short.
SBR, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's relatively new.
Introduced in 2020, right?
Exactly. To help businesses weather the COVID storm.
Makes sense.
It's meant to be a simpler, less costly option for small businesses facing insolvency.
So if VA is like hitting pause, is SBR more like hitting reset for small businesses?
That's a great analogy. One key difference is that SBR lets the business owner stay in control during restructuring.
Oh, really? So they don't have to hand over the reins to an external administrator?
Nope. Which can be huge for small business owners who are really invested in their companies.
I bet. It's about giving them a fighting chance to steer their own ship, even in rough seas.
Exactly. But I imagine there are some specific rules to qualify for this program.
You're right, not every business can just hit the reset button.
What are some of the criteria?
One big one is that their total debts can't be over 1 million Australian dollars.
So there's a clear line in the sand. $1 million. What about businesses that are just over that threshold, though?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Are they just left to fend for themselves?
It definitely raises questions about whether the system is serving all businesses equally.
It's something policymakers are definitely grappling with.
For sure. And it leads us perfectly into the next part of our Australian restructuring saga.
Oh,
The winds of reform are blowing.
sounds intriguing. Let's dive in.
All right, let's do it. So remember that parliamentary inquiry we mentioned earlier?
Yeah, the one that led to the O'Neill report. Right?
Exactly. That report's making waves in the Australian restructuring world.
Really? What's got everyone buzzing?
Well, the biggest takeaway is they're recommending a complete overhaul of Australia's entire insolvency system.
Wow, a complete overhaul. That's huge.
And get this, they're not just looking at corporate insolvency, they're looking at personal insolvency too.
So it's like they're saying, let's rethink everything from businesses to individuals facing financial hardship.
Exactly. It's a pretty ambitious undertaking.
It is. But these massive overhauls take time, right?
You're right. Big reforms like this don't happen overnight.
So are there any smaller, quicker changes on the horizon?
Well, the O'Neill report does recommend some near-term actions.
Okay, like what?
One of the most significant is a revamp of something called the Personal Property Securities Register.
Personal property securities register. That sounds a bit technical.
It is a bit, but it's important. Imagine you're a lender giving out loans to businesses.
Yeah.
You want some assurance you'll get your money back, right?
Of course.
So you ask the borrower to pledge some assets as collateral, like equipment, inventory, even intellectual property.
Okay, I'm following.
This register basically tracks all that collateral. It's like a giant database.
So it's a safety net for lenders. Make sure they have some recourse if things go south.
Exactly. And believe it or not, a review of the system was completed back in 2015.
Wow, 2015. That's a long time ago.
I know, right? The report just sat on a shelf for years, but thanks to the O'Neill report, it's finally getting some attention.
Well, better late than never, I guess. So
Exactly.
what kind of changes are they proposing for this personal property security system?
It's all about simplification, making the system easier to use, more efficient for everyone.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
The rules can be pretty complex and confusing right now. They're looking at streamlining them.
So it's like taking a tangled mess of regulations and making them user-friendly.
Exactly. And this focus on efficiency and clarity isn't limited to just the personal property securities system.
Really?
ASIC, the corporate regulator, is also revising their guidance on all sorts of insolvency-related matters.
So ASIC stepping up to provide clearer instructions and guidelines.
You got it.
What kind of issues are they tackling? What are their priorities?
One area that's getting a lot of attention is the lack of diversity among insolvency practitioners.
Oh, interesting.
It's no secret this field's been a bit of an old boys club for a long time.
Yeah, I can see that.
The O'Neill report's really shining a light on that issue.
So it's not just about reforming the laws themselves, but also about making the industry more inclusive.
Exactly. A more diverse group of practitioners could bring fresh perspectives and new ways of thinking.
It's about tapping into the full range of talent and expertise out there, right?
Absolutely.
So what are some ideas to address this diversity gap?
One sticking point is the strict experience requirements for insolvency practitioners.
So you need a certain number of years under your belt before you can even get started.
Exactly. And for women who may have taken time off for family or caregiving, those requirements can be a real barrier.
So it's like an invisible hurdle that keeps the profession less diverse.
Right. And it's not just about fairness. A more diverse pool of practitioners could benefit the whole system.
Makes sense. What other areas are on ASIC's radar as they revise their guidance?
They're also looking at the reporting requirements for liquidators.
Liquidators. Remind me what those are again.
So when a company goes into liquidation, the liquidator has to explain what went wrong, how the assets were handled, all the details.
So it's about transparency and accountability.
Exactly. But the O'Neill report suggests that these reporting requirements might be too burdensome.
Really? How so?
They might be bogging down liquidators in paperwork instead of letting them focus on getting the best outcome for creditors.
So it's like good intentions gone awry.
Kind of ASIC's trying to find the sweet spot between transparency and efficiency.
It's about making sure the paperwork doesn't become a bureaucratic nightmare.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered some of those near-term actions, but what about the bigger picture?
Now we're getting to the juicy stuff. The O'Neill report opens the door to all sorts of potential reforms.
Okay, give us the inside scoop.
One issue that's particularly tricky is the insolvency of trustees.
Insolvent trustees. I'm not sure I understand what that means.
So imagine a family running a business. They set up a trust to hold the business assets,
Okay.
and they appoint one person, the trustee, to manage those assets for the benefit of the whole family.
Okay, I'm following.
But what happens if that trustee runs into financial trouble?
Uh-oh, I see where this is going.
Australia doesn't actually have clear rules for dealing with insolvent trustees.
So it's a legal gray area.
Exactly. It can cause all sorts of headaches and delays.
So it's like a vital piece of the puzzle is missing.
Exactly. And the O'Neill report is calling for specific legislation to address this gap.
Makes sense. You don't want families fighting over assets or facing legal limbo.
Absolutely.
So what other big picture reform ideas are on the table?
Another interesting debate is around merging corporate and personal insolvency into one system.
Wait, really? Combining those two systems?
It's a controversial idea, but some argue it would streamline things and make them clearer.
So it's like having one rule book instead of two.
Exactly. But critics worry it could create more confusion and make it harder to address the unique needs of companies versus individuals.
I can see that it's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
It's a tough one, for sure.
So it sounds like this harmonization debate is going to be a key part of these discussions.
Definitely.
But Australia is not an island, right? What other international trends are they looking at?
That's a great point. Australia is definitely paying attention to what other countries are doing.
Like what?
One idea gaining traction is creating a dedicated debtor-in-possession regime for medium-sized businesses.
So it's like filling in a missing piece of the puzzle. They've got VA for larger companies and SBR for the small ones, but what about the ones in between?
Exactly. And there are some interesting models out there.
Oh yeah, like what?
Singapore has special financing mechanisms to help struggling businesses access cash.
So they can actually afford to restructure.
Right. And the UK has a cram-down mechanism that lets a court approve a restructuring plan, even if some creditors aren't happy.
Wow, so it can override the creditors.
Only if it's considered fair to everyone involved.
Interesting. It's like a global buffet of insolvency reforms. Australia can pick and choose what works best for them.
Exactly. And with all these potential changes on the horizon, it'll be fascinating to see what direction they take.
I agree. It's an exciting time to be watching the Australian restructuring landscape.
Definitely. They're clearly committed to creating a system that's not just about winding up failed businesses, but about giving them a real chance at recovery and growth.
So we've covered a ton today,
We have.
from how Australia's restructuring system works to all these potential reforms.
It's been quite a journey.
But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, our listener.
Yeah, what does all this mean for them?
Exactly. So quick recap, Australia's got a pretty solid restructuring framework.
Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good.
That VA system's been a lifeline for so many businesses.
Giving them that chance to hit pause, regroup, come back stronger.
But we've also seen there's always room for improvement.
Right.
That O'Neill report, it's a clear sign that Australia's not settling.
They're looking to make things even better.
More efficient, more equitable, more in line with what other countries are doing.
And they're not going it alone either.
That's right. They're looking at what other countries are doing, taking inspiration, adapting it to their own situation.
It's a great example of collaboration and knowledge sharing.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're all in this together. Let's learn from each other and build a better system.
A message that resonates way beyond Australia.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, I've got a question for you to ponder.
Oh, what's that?
With all these potential changes, what impact do you think these reforms could have on Australian businesses and the economy as a whole?
That's a big question.
It is. And what would you prioritize if you were in charge of all this?
Food for thought, for sure.
We've given you the tools and insights. Now it's your turn to imagine the possibilities.
Think about the businesses you interact with, the investments you make.
How might these reforms shape the future?
Share your thoughts, your questions, your predictions.
Keep the conversation going.
Exactly. Knowledge is most valuable when it's shared.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.
And until next time, happy restructuring.
Cheers to that. And a huge thank you to all our amazing listeners.
For joining us on this deep dive into Australian restructuring law.
We'll catch you on our next adventure.